Just south of the rolling foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains and Angeles National Forest lies the beautiful city of Rancho Cucamonga, California. Majestic peaks rise over the town, a place that has grown from vineyards and orchards into the home of some of the world's biggest corporations. With its pleasant streets and homes and lush natural beauty, it's a great place to raise a family for most people. But it was here, from 1987 to 1992, that one of the most horrifying and relentless known cases of paranormal attack played out. The story has been known for years to researchers interested in ghosts, hauntings, and other spontaneous phenomena. But it was earlier this year that interest in the case went viral, as they say. In March, the HuffPost published an article by a California writer and artist named Jessica Moffitt, who told of a force of horror that plagued her family when she was a child. The production company Blumhouse quickly snatched up the rights to create a film version of the story, which is reportedly in the works as of this writing. The events began in not one, not two, but three different houses owned by the husband and in-laws of Deborah Moffitt, Jessica's mother. Deborah chronicled them in a book called Unwelcomed, which Jessica illustrated. Jessica is now writing her own book about the events, though she was too young to remember any of the saga when it unfolded. Deborah and her husband, Bill Jr., met in the early 1980s. At first, they were pen pals living in different parts of the country who sent VHS tapes to each other, recording shows that the other couldn't get on their local channels. It wasn't long before Deborah learned that her new love had something of a shady background. His family had ties to the Sicilian mob. She would also learn from Bill's mother, Lee, that the latter had been well aware of the family's involvement with the mafia, saying that she knew where more than one body was buried, and that she carried guilt and remorse about that awareness. It was Lee that would become the main target of a force that Deborah would eventually come to call Mr. Entity. After they married, Deborah moved to California with Bill and took her place in the family, which owned a large lot with 3 houses on it, situated next to each other in a quiet part of Rancho Cucamonga. Around 1985, the Moffitts decided to hire a caregiver to look after Lee's mother, Dominica, who was well advanced in age. They found a Guatemalan immigrant named Juanita in the area, who moved in shortly after. Despite the good relationship between the two women, age overtook the elder, and she knew that her time on earth was coming to an end. Dominica took Juanita aside one day and told her she should start to look for other work, as she knew her death was imminent. Deborah came to believe that this was the beginning of the family's troubles. The Moffitts would soon discover that Juanita was a practitioner of Santeria, a Cuban-based type of voodoo that meshed Catholicism and Spiritism. They would later learn that Juanita, fearing for her livelihood, had attempted to extend the old woman's life through occult rituals. But the attempts backfired. The night Dominica died, Juanita returned to the house. In the wee hours, she called Deborah, frantic. Deborah and her husband flew from the house to see what the commotion was about, but as they crossed the lawn to head next door, Juanita came running out of the house, screaming for help. Her panic was so great that she fell down the stairs. The Moffitts were frozen in their tracks. They watched what they described as a ball of energy following behind Juanita, as if it were chasing her. As the woman fled the house, a cloud of light flew up into the sky and dissolved. Juanita collapsed, still in shock and trembling. She later told Lee, "Don't ever go back to that house again." A few weeks later, Lee, despite the warnings, went next door to clean in preparation to rent out the house. There, she found candles, blood, feathers, and, to Catholic Lee's deep distress, a scattering of broken rosaries. After their wedding, Deborah and her husband had lived in Bill Jr.'s house, the third of the family's 3 adjacent homes. They decided shortly after to move into his parents' home, as Bill Jr. had a serious medical condition and the family wanted to be together. After the move, they found a tenant, Monty, for the former home. But soon things began to happen around this house and this tenant as well. At first, it was the tenant's belongings. Monty's personal items would inexplicably appear in the middle house where the Moffitts were all now living. Baffled, the Moffitts felt unable to even return them. How could they explain being in possession of them in the first place? The Moffitts had leased the house with the understanding that the tenant had the run of the place, but with one exception. Deborah's husband kept a room in the house for his sports memorabilia, a prized collection. He kept the door locked, but occasionally visited the room after the tenant moved in. One day, he and Deborah visited, and Bill Jr. unlocked the door to find that a large number of his bobblehead figures had been formed into a huge triangle on the floor. The door had been locked as usual, and only Bill Jr. had a key. Of course, the Moffitts assumed the tenant had done it, but when confronted, he vehemently denied it. Not long after, the tenant began telling the Moffitts he was uncomfortable in the house. He said he felt something was trying to contact him, and he admitted to using a Ouija board to attempt that. Then, one day, he said he was moving out, and he was gone without another word. In the vacated house, the Moffitts found symbols scratched into the walls: triangles, crosses, X's, and other unknown inscriptions. Again, they thought the tenant was behind this esoteric vandalism. In the memorabilia room, still locked, they found all of Bill Jr.'s memorabilia facing backwards towards the wall. At the same time, things were escalating in the main family house. Deborah told the late radio host Art Bell that during this time the phenomenon wasn't threatening. She said it was amazing. Things would disappear from one room and appear in other rooms in the literal blink of an eye. Furniture, lamps, they moved with seemingly a will of their own. Sometimes an entire room full of furniture would be switched with that of another. But there still didn't seem to be an intelligence, let alone a hateful one. Except for one thing. Lee found that someone or something had placed a pair of men's briefs over the head of the statue of Jesus on her bedside shrine. Suspecting one of the family, she let it go. Confident that whatever this was now focused on the main house, the Moffitts cleaned the husband's old house and decided to rent it again. The new tenants were a quiet man named Tom and his girlfriend, Michelle. Though the man seemed initially nice and kind, it wasn't long before the girl began telling Deborah that the boyfriend was changing. The man who had been loving and sweet was now hostile and physically abusive. On one occasion, she tried to explain away a black eye, and Deborah told her she'd better get out before something worse happened. And then the girl disappeared. Deborah assumed the young woman had taken her advice and gone to a shelter or sought refuge with family or friends. She was glad she was gone, hopefully to safety and a future peace, and she hoped things would be resolved. But then, without a word, Tom, the tenant, was gone too. They never heard from either of them again. A few weeks later, there was a man who came around, knocking at the door, asking about Tom. Deborah told her he'd left without saying anything, and after a moment of silence, he asked, "Did you hear what happened to Michelle?" The visitor told Deborah that police had found her body wrapped in a rug in a landfill. Mostly because of the family connections to the mafia, the Moffitts never went to the police about the visitor's story. It seemed bogus, or so they told themselves. Surely the visitor was lying or crazy. But when they cleaned the vacated house, one of the rugs was missing. Events continued to escalate on the Moffitt property among the three houses, and eventually the family decided to sell the houses and move away. On their last day on the lot, they were packing up the last boxes in the main house when they heard what sounded like a bomb had hit the kitchen. Rushing down to investigate, they found the cabinets had been ripped off the wall. While staring, dumbfounded at the remains, a huge crash ripped through the upstairs. Running back up, they found the bedroom windows had been blown out as if by a hurricane. That night, with the cars full of boxes, the Moffitts left the family dog at the house to collect in the morning. But when they returned, the dog had been pulled halfway through one of the 4-inch wide spaces in the wrought iron fence. It was dead. The damage prolonged their total departure from the houses where everything had begun. But when the Moffitts were finally settled in their new house, it was like paradise. Bill Jr.'s mother and father lived upstairs in a beautiful suite of their own, and downstairs, Deborah and her husband enjoyed their own space. About 3 weeks after the move, however, a picture of Lee's sister was found turned backward. Lee said maybe it was her dead sister saying hello, but they all knew the thing had followed them. It was after the move that the poltergeist activity started. Bangings, screaming, knockings, all became part of daily life in the new house. The mysterious symbols they'd seen at the tenant's house also began to mark every part of the new house and every one of their belongings. X's, crosses, wheels, and other marks were scratched into the plaster and the molding, cut into the bedding and clothing. In particular, one symbol appeared more and more often, a triangle with a squiggly tail. One day, they found the symbol had been cut out of a 14-foot-long rug. On another, it was carved out of one of the mattresses. Later, it would be scratched into the family car. One night, soon after the move, the family was serenaded by what sounded like Native American drumming, bum, 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 for hours through the night. And then the messages started. The first of them was written in soap on the bathroom mirror. "Talk to me," it said. At first, the entity pretended to be Lee's deceased sister, as Lee had hoped it was when she'd seen the picture turned around. The thing used the dead sister's nickname of Nini to convince Lee of the truth of the claim, but they all knew from the start that it was lying. At first, of course, every person in the family thought one of the others was responsible, but all denied it. And so to test their suspicion of one another, the four of them would write a question on the mirror and then leave the bathroom, shut the door, and wait. They'd open the door shortly after, and there would be writing in response. Exasperated and in awe of what was happening, they finally asked of the mirror writer, "What is your name?" writing it again in soap. Then they filed outside the bathroom, closed the door, and held their breath. When they opened the door again, the entity had answered. On the mirror, in soap, was written, "Prince." Scores of messages later, the family knew that one message encompassed all of them. "I hate Lee." It was Lee who was the target of this thing. Over and over, this thing through the writing said it hated her, that it was going to kill her, that she was going to die. The thing tormented her day and night. It cut the arms out of her clothes, bleached her clothing hanging in the closet, cut up her wallet and money and ID cards. Over and over, it pulled off the heads and arms of her religious figures, including that statue of Jesus. Knives would be found on Lee's chair, in her bed, and stuck deep into the walls of her room. At the beginning, there was little writing and a lot of destruction. Though it focused on Lee, no part of the house was safe from its wrath. It decimated every room in the house, gouging its symbol into the walls, floors, and doors until everything was marked with it. It used baby powder, Vaseline, and grease to draw it on the carpets, the furniture, and even the car. A triangle with a squiggly tail. On one occasion, Deborah walked into the small master bedroom, and the four-poster bed, too large to turn without taking it apart, was standing on end on a single leg. It hovered there long enough for her to take a picture. On another occasion, a detailed, elaborate wheel was drawn on the mirror, with a variety of names etched with soap within the spokes. At the bottom was the name of the demon Baal. Lee, a Catholic who had not been to church for many years but prayed at a bedside shrine each night, believed she was being punished for her sins. Ashamed, she long rebuked the family when they talked about bringing in someone to help, but finally, she relented. The first person they called was a priest. When he arrived, he stood in the foyer, and he wouldn't go any further into the house. He flicked holy water into the parlor and muttered some prayer. Even Deborah, not Catholic or religious at all, said, "Aren't you supposed to go from room to room?" He said that no, it was fine. And then he said, "I have to go." Lee tried to explain that they desperately needed help, more help than this. She began to tell him the horrifying details of their situation. He turned to Deborah, made the crazy sign with a finger to his temple, and ran out. No one could get rid of it. The Moffitts began bringing in every kind of help they could think of in an effort to drive out the thing Deborah now called Mr. Entity, refusing to call it by its stated name of Prince. After each left, the entity would critique them with soap writing, saying this one was a joke or this one had no power. Mr. Entity also repeatedly wrote simply fool. Deborah knew that one was meant not only for their string of visitors, but for the Moffitts themselves. Mr. Entity took to bringing up things from the past, often shameful things the family members had done, and it began making predictions about the future and about things that had happened far away that no one could have known. A few days after the famed parapsychologist D. Scott Rogo came to the house to investigate, the entity wrote on the mirror, "Scott Rogo is dead." Deborah erased it and pressed for more information. Mr. Entity replied that Rogo had been murdered. The news that night confirmed that it was true. A still unknown assailant had stabbed Scott Rogo to death in his own home. Mr. Entity seemed to speak all languages and often wrote in a variety of them on the mirror. Its repertoire included an obscure dialect from Sicily, Tobrash, that only Lee and Bill Jr. could understand. They would speak to one another in Tobrash, thinking Mr. Entity couldn't understand them, and the thing would comment on their conversations in Tobrash. Ed and Lorraine Warren came in the winter of 1989. They stayed a long time. Lorraine, a self-proclaimed light trance medium, said there was a very ancient and very intelligent evil being in the Moffitt house, one of the most powerful she'd ever encountered. Deborah remembers Lorraine turning to her husband, sitting next to her on the couch, and saying, "This is bad, Ed." After an initial investigation, the couple returned to do a rite of provocation designed to force the thing to show itself. When Ed began the rite, Bill Sr. began to change. His arm curled up to his chest, and his body became hunched over. Ed held what he said was a relic of the true cross on which Jesus had been crucified. Later, Deborah would believe that Mr. Entity had entered the old man to speak through him. Ed said, "God protects me. Christ protects me." He told the thing that the piece of wood he held would shield him from any harm. In response, the old man began to speak, saying that he would bite off Ed's hand, chew the relic to pieces, and spit the pieces in his face. The Warrens then arranged for an Episcopalian priest to come to the house to exorcise it. At first, the family all agreed to the visit, but then Bill Sr. told Lee that she could be excommunicated from the Catholic Church for agreeing to this visit from a priest outside the faith. When the priest arrived, his entry was barred, and the exorcism never happened. After the Warrens' visit failed to bring relief, the Moffitts continued to bring in every manner of occultist to try and rid their lives of Mr. Entity. They brought a Native American shaman who said he put the spirit into the family dog. After the dog became ill and died, the events began again. They brought in a witch from a nearby occult shop who performed a ritual in the house and announced that Bill Jr.'s illness had created a sort of tangible negativity that was now tormenting him. The talismans she left behind were found in the swimming pool a few hours after she left. Then 2 local women came in, promising to get the thing to show itself so they could banish it. Deborah recalled later that it was the only time she ever heard the voice of Mr. Entity. Its sinister laugh could be heard thundering through the house as they went from room to room, and it slammed the doors behind and in front of them until they fled. Next, a magician came and placed eggs around the parlor, chanting something in Spanish. When the eggs started pelting him with violent force, he quickly made his exit. A voodoo priestess came from Louisiana, and in desperation, the family allowed another practitioner of Santeria, hoping the cause might also hold the cure. With other options exhausted, the Moffitts turned to science for help, reaching out to Thelma Moss, founder of the parapsychology lab at UCLA. The famed parapsychologist Carrie Gaynor arrived to investigate, but the investigation included a seance in which a psychic medium supposedly revealed the truth behind the family's affliction. She said the spirit in the house was that of Deborah's uncle, who'd been accidentally drowned by her grandfather as a child. The torment of Deborah's family was his revenge, or so she said. The family then called Lloyd Auerbach, another well-known parapsychologist who came to investigate, but left only baffled. By the time Evelyn Puglini arrived, the thing had taken over the entire upstairs suite where Bill Sr. and Lee had been living. The whole family, now with babies in tow, slept in the downstairs master bedroom together. Puglini, a witch from Chicago, was one of the most anticipated of all who came to the Moffitt house to offer help. Puglini was held in high esteem by people like Art Bell. She definitely put a spell on people with her intelligence and charisma. Mr. Entity was extremely uncomfortable with Puglini. The thing would write to her in symbols on the mirror, and she would respond in kind with symbols of her own. She claimed that the entity was one of the 7 princes of hell. Puglini also announced that someone in the house was giving the thing permission to stay, and so she couldn't get it to go. She performed a ritual to disclose who it was. That night, Bill Sr. woke up choking, unable to breathe. After a minute, with the family gathered around thinking he would die, he swiftly stopped and fell back asleep. "It's him," Puglini announced the next morning. Before leaving, Puglini made a last-ditch suggestion to Deborah. Give Mr. Entity a room of its own, and it will let the rest of the house be. But Deborah refused. What Puglini said, however, made more and more sense the more Deborah pondered it. Earlier on, after those first months of threatening, hateful messages, Deborah had finally asked Mr. Entity why it was targeting her mother-in-law, a sweet little old lady. In a detailed response, so long that for a good half hour, Deborah had to keep erasing the writing to give the thing more space. The entity spun the most detailed of its many convoluted tales. Hundreds of years ago, it claimed, me had in a former life, of course, been a nun at a monastery in Europe. At the monastery were monks who worshipped Satan, and they had prepared a blood ritual to sacrifice Lee to this particular demon, Mr. Entity. But something had gone wrong, and the girl had escaped. The entity had been cheated. Lee belonged to it, and the thing had come to collect its due. The family began to believe that Bill Sr. had warmed up to the entity's plan to destroy Lee. There was talk later about the wealth Lee had inherited and about the fact that the couple had no shared bank account. The money was all hers and would only be his if she died. Through the entire odyssey, Deborah observed that Lee's husband made no effort to protect her and seemed nonplussed by the entity, totally unafraid, while the rest of the family lived in terror of it. Deborah first began to suspect something when Bill began to go into the bathroom and write on the mirror alone. A few minutes later, he'd go back in and erase what the thing had written back. And then, in the messages, Mr. Entity began to encourage Bill to kill his wife. After weeks of chiding, it even provided a weapon. One day, a long iron spear appeared next to Bill Sr. On the mirror appeared the message, "I want a blood ritual." The Moffitts took the spear to the Los Angeles History Museum. There, experts, intrigued and baffled, declared it to be from the Belgian Congo in Africa. It was some 200 years old, they insisted, but looked like it had been forged yesterday. Back at home, the Moffitts asked Mr. Entity where the spear had come from. "The Congo," it answered. When Deborah made it clear there would be no blood ritual, the thing blew out all of the upstairs windows. It had now been 6 years since Mr. Entity's torments had begun. Deborah and Bill Jr. finally convinced Lee that she had to force her husband to leave the house. But the activity kept on, even after his departure. One of the last to come to help was Brian Hurst, a self-described medium who brought a young investigator with him named Gary. Mr. Entity seemed to hate Gary almost as much as Lee, and Gary was in awe of the thing's power, even after it took to ripping out Gary's hair. Despite the abuse, Gary began to think of inviting the entity to come with him to England, where he would soon be moving. Down on his luck, he thought Mr. Entity, with its tremendous power, might grant him some kind of power of his own and help to change his life. At first, the thing wrote on the mirror in response to Gary's invitation, refusing to go and calling him an inferior being. But then, Mr. Entity changed its mind. It agreed to go with Gary, and it wrote, "You are now my servant." After Gary had packed up and gone, the Moffitts found a final message on the bathroom mirror. "Goodbye, my family." Several weeks later, Gary told Deborah that the thing had carved its symbol into the door of his new apartment. Then, they never heard from him again. Deborah still lives in the house in Rancho Cucamonga. 25 years have passed since Mr. Entity left that message to her bedraggled clan. Her children, too young at the time to remember all that had transpired, grew up knowing nothing of what had happened. During the turmoil, visiting helpers had repeatedly told Deborah to destroy the thousands of photographs the Moffitts had taken of the destruction, the symbols, the mirror writing, the mess, believing the photos were giving power to the thing. Deborah got rid of them all. But years later, after Bill Jr.'s death, she found that he had kept copies of hundreds of the images. With everyone else dead who had witnessed the family horror, she decided to break her promise of secrecy and finally publicly tell the story. Many have tried to deduce just who or what Mr. Entity was. A popular claim is that it was a jinn. A jinn is a mythical Muslim or Arabian entity, a trickster spirit that's supposedly lower than a fallen angel. Some searched through occult books to find an identity behind the thing's signature sign, including a self-described light worker from Carson, California, named David Zabriskie. He showed Deborah an old book with a familiar symbol in it and the words demon of destruction. One caller to the Art Bell show said that he had seen that symbol while serving in Afghanistan, and that it was a symbol of a powerful jinn that was the head of the devil. Jinn, fairies, sylphs, nymphs, none of these spirits are actual separate beings. They are all demons, fallen angels. Over millennia, these fallen angels have appeared in many forms, in many cultures, adopting various guises and, of course, inspiring entire systems of folk belief and leading people to believe that there is an extensive taxonomy of spiritual beings. But there isn't a taxonomy, and Mr. Entity wasn't a jinn. Mr. Entity was a demon. There were many things gravely wrong with the family's response to this demonic attack. Deborah said that communication was everything to the demon. It insisted that the family talk to it. If they didn't write responses on the mirror, it would destroy the house. It also encouraged the family to get a Ouija board and to use it to talk to the spirit, something that should never, ever be done. A big reason for this is that the devil lies. The entire story spun by the demon, including the past life of Lee, the blood sacrifice gone awry, was nonsense. Demons love to play with us, invent things, and generally addle our minds. But when the church let them down, it's unsurprising that the Moffitts turned to other spiritual means of help. The family should not be condemned for this. They had tried to go the right route, and the church had failed them. They were living in, literally, a nightmare from hell. That said, bringing in a parade of occultists was equally insane. If there wasn't something there before, there certainly was after the witches, voodoo priestesses, shamans, Santeria practitioners, mediums, and magicians paid their visit. Aside from all of these issues, the real trouble began with the family, not one aspect of it, but many. It was a perfect storm that created the ideal environment for what was, without a doubt, some level of demonic presence in the family and in their home. Infestation, obsession, vexation, possession. The case seems a jumbled mess of all of it. The fact that no one in the family practiced their faith was a big issue. Deborah said she had been raised Lutheran but didn't practice. Lee was a, quote, devout Catholic but didn't go to church. Those are opposite statements and can't both be true. A Catholic is bound to attend Mass at least on Sundays and to receive the sacrament. An old friend of mine is Ralph Sarchi, former New York City police sergeant, on whose life the film Deliver Us from Evil is based. Sarchi was an apprentice of the Warrens and of the late Jesuit exorcist Malachi Martin. When I asked Ralph to help with a case where a demonic presence seemed to be involved, he said he couldn't help anyone who wasn't Catholic and wasn't receiving the sacraments. This may sound shocking and suspect to anyone who follows some of the popular exorcists who appear on various YouTube channels. For example, Father Vincent Lampert has gone on record saying that people must appeal to their own faith tradition for help with possession. The Moffitt family ties to the mafia almost certainly also contributed to the powerlessness of the family against this demon, and probably also attracted it. Unconfessed sin is not only a magnet for demons, but also a weapon that can be used against the sinner. Lee's admission that she knew where the bodies were buried and bore guilt over it was a good example of something other members of the family were likely burdened with. In addition, at least one visiting helper, Brian Hurst, believed that Bill Sr. and the caregiver Juanita were involved in a romantic relationship, and that the rituals the latter performed were connected to that. The illness of Bill Jr. may also have contributed to an environment that lacked the protective power of the head of the house that's so important. Yes, Deborah was a strong head of the home, a one-woman army against the demon. But according to the Christian faith, this should have been her husband's role, but he was too sick to take it. Similarly, Bill Sr. seemed uncaring of the family, especially his wife. and quite possibly even hostile towards them. Not a good situation for anyone involved. Finally, the practice of Santeria in the grandmother's home was about the worst thing that could have been done in a situation so full of illness, shady history, and lack of religious practice. I feel so deeply for this family, and I can only imagine the terror of living through this hell. Still, I fear that the worst move of all was just made, that the worst is yet to come. And once again, resurrecting this tragedy, Deborah and her daughter are choosing to reopen a box of evil that plagued their family for 6 years. This often happens after exorcisms. The person or family misses the excitement, the specialness, the wonder, and they do things to invite back the vanquished entity. They usually don't mean to, but that doesn't matter. I can't imagine keeping secret an experience like the one the Moffitts lived through. And certainly, Deborah wants people to know that these things are real. The 2 books about it are out of print. I know firsthand the frustration of that. And her daughter wants to be part of this, her family's incredible story. Deborah told the story. Now her daughter, who doesn't even remember the events, is enchanted by the tale and wants to write her own book. And the rights to tell the story will result in a film that will most certainly lead to many, many people trying to conjure the demon that tormented the Moffitts. Because that's what, in this strange world of evil, people do. If you glance at Reddit, you'll find that a whole generation of young people has been trying to conjure the demon known as King Paimon, popularized in the film Hereditary. And for decades, others have been trying to invoke the demon Pazuzu after learning about the thing in The Exorcist. A whole cult operates around the demon Lam, famously conjured by Aleister Crowley a century ago in New York. Many people are so spiritually lost, I have a feeling that resurrecting Mr. Entity isn't going to go well.